In the early 20th century, when a person passed away, they would typically end up in a cemetery. But if they died during the winter, they couldn't be buried right away because the ground was typically frozen solid. So instead, they would end up in a winter vault. I'm Gordon Goldsborough, past president of the Manitoba Historical Society, radio and newspaper columnist, and author of books on the neglected, the overlooked, the hidden places from Manitoba's past. Join me in this series as we explore back roads to places that tell great stories about how things used to be and how we have ended up where we are today. This is Abandoned Manitoba. We're here in the Transcona Cemetery in the rural municipality of Springfield at the site of one of 3 winter vaults in Manitoba, but it is very typically a winter vault because the legislation that governs these sort of structures demands that, first of all, they be made out of durable materials, and this one is. It's made out of bricks, it's made out of concrete. It also specifies that it must have windows covered with iron, and this one does. It's a little different because the door is supposed to be either made out of metal or wood clad in metal. And, well, there's no metal. This one's just a wooden door. And I think that may be because over the years it stopped being a winter vault and was simply used for groundskeeping equipment. So they may have just taken the metal off, perhaps. But the other detail is that they had to have 2 levels. There would be the upper level, which was typically sort of a chapel where they could have memorial services for the person. The lower level would be the vault. That's where they would actually keep the bodies prior to burial. Now, this particular building is buried in the ground, and I want to see if we can get into the lower level where they would have kept the caskets prior to burial. Oh my. So it looks like at one time there probably would have been either a stairs or a ramp going down into the ground, and this is where they would have carried the caskets down into the lower level. But as you can see, the door has been boarded over. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me that they've actually filled this whole area with soil so that it's physically impossible now to get into that door. So it means that the lower level is basically inaccessible, I think. There is one other winter vault that I know of in Winnipeg, and it's here, in the St. Mary Cemetery on Osborne Street. This is the oldest winter vault in Manitoba, built in 1906, designed by a very prominent architect, Samuel Hooper, and constructed by a very prominent contractor, James McDermott. It does fit most of the criteria for a winter vault, but not all of them. So, for example, it is made of brick. That's one of the requirements for a winter vault. But for example, it doesn't have metal bars over its windows. It doesn't have metal cladding on its entrance door. And maybe most significantly, it does have burials close to the walls. And according to the law, you're supposed to be at least 15 feet away from the edge of the wall. And I don't quite think that's the case here. The history of winter vaults go back centuries, especially in northern European countries where gravediggers had to resort to all sorts of methods to bury the dead in winter. The most common approach was to build a bonfire at the burial site to thaw ground sufficiently to allow digging. They were known by a variety of names: death house, mort house, charnel house, corpse house, receiving vault. But the name that I think fits best is winter vault, because basically they were a place to store the dead until you could do the burials in the thawed ground of the summer. Unfortunately, I can't take a look inside this winter vault either, but I know where there is one that I should be able to gain access to. It's right here in the town of Melita in southwestern Manitoba. They were called vaults for a good reason, because they were really solidly built. This one's a lot like the one we saw in Transcona. It has brick walls on a concrete foundation. This roof is covered in metal tiles. The door is armored with metal. It's really solidly built to protect the contents. Architecturally, this vault is really quite interesting. It's made from these light red bricks. There are actually quite a few other buildings in Melita made from the same bricks. They were locally made by a company called the Melita Brick and Tile Company for over a period of only about 5 years, from 1905 to 1910. And that fits perfectly with the age of this building. This one was put up in 1908. The bricks, of course, provide the structure of the upper level, which is a chapel. In fact, if you look at the windows, you can see there's sort of that archway at the top. It looks very church-like. And that's because the second level of the vault was used as a chapel. You know, potentially the person who was to be buried may have died months earlier, and they had a funeral at the time, but then they would have another service prior to the burial. So hence the second floor was essentially a little chapel. The lower level, that's where the storage would occur. The Melita Winter Vault was constructed by local contractors Robert Johnston and George Pope. Eventually, Mr. Pope moved to Brandon, where he died in 1950. Mr. Johnson, however, died in 1926 and is buried here in the Mita Cemetery. And I have to wonder if he didn't spend just a little bit of time in the winter vault that he constructed in 1908. So this is a typical door for a winter vault. Although it's wood, it's clad in metal, again, for that protective purpose. Much as I'd like to go in here to see what the chapel looks like, but right now they've actually got somebody in residence. And so we can't go in the top level, but that's okay. Because in fact, when this winter vault was actively being used, they wouldn't have used the upstairs for that purpose. They would have used the downstairs. So we're going to go and have a look to see if we can get into the lower area of the winter vault. Wow. Well, they were clearly building for the future when they built this vault. These racks that they have here are for the holding the caskets, and looks, by the look of it, I'm thinking what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 12, 18, probably room for about 21 caskets. They were obviously building for the future. They would need at some point this many for winter burials. It's really a solid building too. I mean, you can see the lines in the concrete where they were pouring it. They would probably, looks like they pour maybe about 3 feet, and then they'd wait for it to cure, then they'd pour another one. But, you know, it seems to me that they really didn't make the foundation strong enough because, well, you can see, in fact, there's these metal rods that are running from the front to the back. I suspect they probably had some shifting problems through the years, and they had to fix that with these metal rods. Well, in fact, here, look at this. This is interesting. You can see through the wall, right through to the outside, you can see the sunlight on the other side. And it looks to me like there's no reinforcing rods at all. You know, typically today, if you were to make a concrete wall, you'd put, you know, rebar, you know, reinforcing steel to hold the wall. But this one doesn't look like it's got any of that. So that's why I think we're getting the shifting problems we're getting. The ceiling here is made up of fir joists, really solid. And yeah, here, this is the opening. Okay, so if they're storing the caskets down here, and then they later have a service in the chapel above, you'd, I guess, have some kind of pulley system that you would raise the casket up through this opening, up into the chapel above. And then a lot of shifting on the floor. I bet you they've had some flooding in here. You know, we're not that far from the creek, and I bet you water comes in here some years, and so the floor has shifted and buckled. Oh, wow. Really cool. Today, it is no longer necessary to use winter vaults. Modern machinery, such as jackhammers and backhoes, can dig in frozen ground without too much difficulty. But occasionally, there can be circumstances that may allow a winter vault to be useful again. For example, an elderly person who died recently in the Melita area won't be buried until the spring, when relatives from far away can attend the service. Until then, the casket is held upstairs in the locked winter vault.